5, and we are back. This is great. So welcome, everyone. Welcome. So glad to be with you guys today. Welcome to our panel where we're going to be discussing AI ethics and inclusive tech design through a Black lens. So my name is Gagnon-Joseph. I'm an associate at Real Ventures, and I'm also the founder of Rep Matters, which is focused on empowering Black participation in the innovation economy. With me today, we have Elizabeth Adams, Chief AI Ethics and Culture Advisor at EMA Advisory Services, and Leadership of Responsible AI Scholar, Practitioner, Stanford University Institute of Human-Centered AI, as well as Korri Jones, a Senior Machine Learning Engineer at Chick-fil-A, Inc. And these two AI experts are here to share their perspectives with us on AI ethics and how to build inclusive tech products. So first of all, I'd like to thank you both for taking the time out of your busy schedules to have this conversation with us. I'm really looking forward to this. So let's jump right in. And to kick things off, I'd like you to introduce yourselves and talk about what attracted you to the world of AI. So Elizabeth, why don't we start with you?
Sure. First off, let me say I am so excited to be here today. Thank you so much for the invitation. I have been in the AI ethics space for the past 4.5 years, but I've been a technologist for over 20 years. I like to call myself a business technologist because I sit between technical teams and executives, kind of helping them understand requirements. Well, that was my former life. I got into AI ethics, honestly, because I saw a video by Joy Buolamwini called AI Ain't I a Woman? And that video highlights how there were some facial recognition systems that were unable to identify Black women accurately. And so I knew that being a Black woman in tech, this was absolutely an area that I wanted to get involved in and started working within my community. So this is what I do. The focus has changed over the last several months. I now work on what I call leadership of responsible AI, which is a shared leadership function between technical and non-technical executives to adopt and operationalize responsible AI. And I did that, and we'll get into that, because I saw that that was really where a lot of the decision-making power was. So again, thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Amazing. Thank you for that introduction. Korri.
Fantastic. Like I'm stoked by hearing your energy over there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're tuning in at. My name is Korri Jones, and I am like, when this opportunity even came up, I was like, you know what, this is something I believe in. When we start talking about ethics, ethics is like at the core of all things. As you see, I'm on the engineering side, deep nitty gritty. I'm the guy you call when stuff goes wrong, and we want to make sure stuff doesn't go wrong. And so when some of the excitement about this particular session, let's actually pull back a second. I want to talk about AI. Why was I even interested in this thing? I am a mathematics teacher. Typical people say I'm a retired mathematician. And so I remember when I was an educator, I would think about like what was happening in the data as people were saying so many students this or so many educators this. These random statistics would come up and these random models and things that were going out there. People were making decisions off of this. And I was like, I don't know if they really see what's happening, because this is manipulating how people are perceiving things. You know, if I say something is really, really bad, you know, because my model is saying it's awful, but in reality, it's not as awful as it is because your data inherently was biased, meaning that what you brought in wasn't the way it was already influenced. Therefore, what you got out was more influenced. And I saw this. I saw as the students I was working with there, you know, it was affecting them. And so that's when I started to say, hey, this is pretty interesting. Let me start to learn a little bit more. As a mathematician, I touch a little bit on statistics. And I remember sitting in the class one day, not that I was teaching, I was taking the class, and we talked about the prison system. And, you know, as a Black male, that's something that's really top of mind for me. I mean, there's so many things if you just look back in the past year. And so it's even more about that. But the thing about it was like, let's take a look at this. And I remember sitting in this class, and there were two folks of color in the class, and they were going through sentencing for Black men and Black women. And the data was so bad. It was like, and you could see, hey, this Black male did this one thing, and they got 3 times as long a sentence for somebody with the same non-criminal record that was not. And there's just crickets in the room. And I was like, this is something I love. But that's just a little bit about me on that. I do a whole bunch of other stuff, but that's not the topic of today. This is about this particular topic right now. So I'm just stoked and excited to be here.
Amazing introduction. Thank you for that. I kind of lost you for a bit, actually. So I hope that you all see me and hear me now. I think I'm having a little bit of some technical issues, but let's press forward if we can. So there are two key terms that we sort of found through our initial conversation on these topics, and that was really AI ethics and inclusive tech design. Can you give us a definition of these so that everyone is operating from the same understanding and the same baseline?
Yeah, I'll start. So I think that's an interesting question. And it also is part of my research at Pepperdine, which is how are we defining certain terms, right, around AI? But for AI ethics, what I tend to think of when I think of AI ethics is that it's a processes and procedures and guidelines and frameworks that govern how you do AI. And so they can be principles, but they're your values or all these things that are a part of it. I think the next step is the inclusive tech design, which is how are you designing it? What are the perspectives? Korri can get into the ones and zeros, but who are you designing it for? Are these folks a part of the conversations? And it's just not about the tech design when you think about ones and zeros, but it's about product development. So who are the marketing folks? Who are the customer care folks? Who are all these folks that have a hand in approving this particular technology before it goes out the door? And it's just also not diverse perspectives in terms of ethnic diversity, but it's also physical abilities, a number of different things that need to be considered. And for me, the next step after that is actually putting all of that in practice by operationalizing it. And that's what I was saying about leadership of responsible AI.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Thank you for that. Korri, is there anything that you'd like to add?
I love those definitions. The only thing when I think about ethics, I go back to like that core phrase, do no harm. And that's something that's so very hard sometimes if you don't have those diverse perspectives in the room. And to make sure, and I think I'll elaborate on this, and I'm sure Elizabeth agrees with this as well, diversity is bigger than just race. Mm-hmm. Diversity has so many different paradigms. You're talking about experience and inexperience. Inexperience is a beautiful thing. Sometimes we don't talk about the value of having that in a room. The beginner's mindset to ask the questions that the rest of us who've been doing this work for so long we're kind of numb to it. So we're not going to ask those questions. And so I think that to hone in on diversity, to have the right people, different people with perspectives, experience, ages, all of that in the room. Or if they're not in a room, have them to be able to speak into what's happening in the room. Mm-hmm. And I think that becomes really important. But it goes back to do no harm. If we're going to do something with our machine learning and statistical models, and if at the end of the day, if you would ask somebody would ask you, did you make sure that you weren't trying to harm anybody directly or indirectly? Did you do your due diligence? And if the answer is no, that's a problem.
Yeah. And Philip, if I could, I love that how Korri broke that down. And one thing that I'll add, and the reason why I specifically point to inclusive interests in tech design is because we all come with different values, right? Our values that we hold are different. And so the people who are designing these technologies that don't look like us or maybe don't have the same physical abilities, their values are going to be different. And so that, again, is why it's so important to have inclusion all the way throughout the entire AI ethics lifecycle. And we probably lost him again, so we probably can continue. If looks like we did.
We did. So we're going to make the most out of this. So fantastic.
Yes. Yeah. Well, he wanted to know why we were so quick to say yes. And I think we kind of talked about that, why we're so quick to say yes to this. But I would like an opportunity to elaborate, Korri, if that's okay with you.
Hop on in there.
So for 3 years, so Phil, we're on to the question of why we're so excited.
Sorry about that. I'm having technical difficulties, but yes.
But why we said yes? And so
tell us.
Yeah, so I spent 3 years immersed in the community here in Minneapolis, working with policymakers, working with social activists, working with public trust activists, and actually co-founding a coalition called the Public Oversight of Surveillance Technology and Military Equipment. And after the murder of George Floyd, our coalition became particularly interested in how surveillance tools were being used by law enforcement here in Minneapolis. And what was disheartening for me was not so much about the policies that we were trying to get enacted, which we were successful in getting facial recognition banned. But tech design is still going to happen. But what was disheartening to me was all of these community members who were trading time from with their families or going on vacation or to museums to advocate for what should be a human right, safe technology. And so that is why I decided to start pivoting to more of the leaders, because I saw all of these folks and a lot of people who are data scientists or engineers, they do their work and they go home and they get a chance to, kick it at happy hour. But there's a whole segment of society that doesn't get to do that because they're showing up to make sure that their rights are not infringed upon. And so that's the reason why I said yes, because I knew that we were going to be able to really have a deep conversation about this.
Amazing. Thank you. Korri, had you already started that? Or all right, perfect. So, Korri, why were you so excited about this opportunity? And you came with a lot of energy, so I want to hear. I want to know.
Yeah, right. I have all the energy. Don't worry. I think I was joking with somebody that says I can't do coffee, and so it all comes from the inside. So there's no caffeine. It's just all there. But some of the excitement with this type of discussion is, again, I walk into the room, and it's just me from a diverse standpoint. Sometimes that's just becoming a norm, specifically when I start getting deeper into my area of specific expertise. When I get more and more fine grained, it becomes less and less and less. And so people are normally interested in my opinion and my perspective. Hey, what do you think about this? What about that? What about that? And, it starts to make me, for me personally, I love that discussion. But on the flip side, I wish it was more spread out. I wish that there was more interaction with people to kind of expand their thinking. And I'll give an interesting analogy or an allegory. So there was this, have y'all heard of the concept of curve cutting? If not, so I want you to think about, you're in the middle of a city. Doesn't matter where it is in the world. Hopefully it doesn't matter. But you're in the middle of a city. You have a baby stroller. You got to go down the curb, right? There was a point in time when those curbs were always really tall. That was just what people expected. That was the norm. And so what happened was there were enough students, and I forgot the university where this was at. They said, you know what? We're going to curb cut. And so they started to cut the curbs so that it was mostly to help folks that were disabled to be able to get back and forth because it was a challenge. And so in this case, it's a physical design, but I think that carries over to the concept of technology design. I think in many cases, we're still learning on how to be more inclusive with things that are not technology related. And we have to continue to take all of this learning together as we talk about tech design, the inclusivity of that. We need to also pair that back to things that are happening in the real world. And how can we kind of do all of this? Because at the end of the day, when they did that, they were helping out disabled men and women, right? Hey, I'm in a wheelchair. I'm having so many issues. There's only one curve cut for me to go down way down here. And I have to, 15 minutes to get back. That's tough. But they didn't recognize or realize that when they took that time, guess what? They opened the door for men and women with baby strollers. Other people who were on crutches. You start to think about just the impact. And so ultimately, that's another thing I'm really interested in, the impact. As we start to think more about inclusivity with our tech design, it may solve this problem that we see today. But the reality is it's probably solving 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different problems down the line. And so I'm excited about this type of discussion. I'm so happy to be here because I see the impact down the line of all of the decisions that we're making. And so that's a little bit about that. And hopefully that analogy helped kind of put some perspective right there. And so, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. That leads right into my next thought, which is, how does non-inclusive tech design affect Black communities now? So I know that you see the ripple effects of what inclusive tech design would do. And I'll start with Elizabeth and I'll go to Korri. How is that affecting Black communities today? You give the example of facial recognition, and I'm sure there are many others.
There are others, and I'll just highlight to Korri. I think there's some comments in the chat for you to just pull your mic back a little bit. There's a little feedback, but so and we're friends here. That's why I can do that. So so let's think about housing. Think about how housing decisions are made, predictive analytics. Think about how insurance rates are happening. Think about education, who gets into what colleges, think about resume sifting, think about healthcare, think about COVID vaccinations, and distributions and testing, all of these kinds of algorithms. And I'll give you one particular example here in Minnesota. So I was a part of a Facebook group called the Vaccination Hunters, and we were helping people find vaccinations around the state. And what the state of Minnesota did was they partnered with this pharmacy that had most of their pharmacies in northern Minnesota, but most of the cases and most people live in the metropolitan area. And so it was curious to me that we were trying to find vaccination appointments for people who lived here who'd have to travel 5 hours away, right?
Wow.
Predominantly African-American communities, they have to travel farther away, people with different health challenges. And that didn't make any sense to me, why that distribution did not happen right where the bulk of the people were, right where the hot spots were for COVID. But that was because the state partnered with someone, they used some algorithm. And then they would have like 11,000 appointments at a pharmacy that's like 5 hours away, when the city only has like maybe 1,000 people. That just doesn't make sense to me. So that's just kind of like one particular example. We did talk about facial recognition. In a session I did earlier, I actually showed a computer vision model of two people, both of them taking an infrared, taking a temperature with an infrared thermometer, but the computer vision model with the darker skin hand and the darker skin person predicted in that particular image that the thermometer was a gun. And with the lighter skinned person and the lighter hand, it predicted that it was probably photography or some sort of mobile device. And so these are the ways that this information, these images are making their way into databases, and then the police are determining whether or not this person could possibly be a threat based on some false algorithm or false predictive analytics. And so there are a number of different ways, and we will not have time to cover them all, but those are just a few that I address in my work and research.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And let me know if somebody drops it in the chat if I'm still giving you some feedback or you can't hear me. Am I good?
Thanks for that.
Groovy. That quarter of an inch made a difference. So I love everything that you're saying here. So this is something that I think it has a lot of roots. There's a lot of different tentacles to this thing. And so it goes back to, and I'll dive really tactical really quickly, is that sometimes there's a case where from a historical standpoint, I'll speak from the United States and then we can go global. From a United States standpoint, data about indigenous people, whether they're Native American or African American, it's polluted. It's polluted. It has so much bias. Hey, these people this or that or whatever the case, positive or negative, the numbers are off. People weren't paying attention when they were doing it over the years. And so what you now have is this case, and I think I mentioned a little bit, is where the data is already biased. It's biased. It's not pure, unfiltered, the truth. Like, we talk about ground truth, like this is like a cracked ground truth of data that's now being used to build models because it's all we have. And so if that's the case, what's occurring is that people are now building models from polluted and biased data, right? And so the algorithm of the model itself, at the end of the day, it may be nothing wrong with the model. It's with the source. The source was wrong, but we're not asking the question to say, hey, there was a significant discrimination. You can even do this for men and women. We start looking at women in different parts of the world, significant discrimination. So they weren't showing up at clinics or different jobs or anything. And so you start talking about pay disparities. All of this plays a role in it. And so when I think about how this affects our community, African-American community, and actually I'd say African communities around the world, depending on where they are, is that it all comes from the fact that source data, the things that we're building these algorithms from, have already been heavily biased. And so that's affecting the facial recognition stuff. That's affecting decisions and algorithms that are talking about what is a normal sentencing for somebody committing particular crimes. Because guess what? When you build these types of things, what do? They look at pre-existing data. They look at what happened prior to make a prediction to identify the pattern. When you get into the minutia, it's the pattern. And so if the patterning mechanism was under the hood, the data has already been messed up, it becomes a bad situation. And so sometimes we bump into this situation where we're looking to hire super data scientists and men and women that are doing things and building the models outside of asking the question, is our data telling the story it needs to tell? And can we identify, is this attacking or is it supporting? Like, what is it? We want it completely unbiased. And so I think it goes back to the ethics conversation. Do no harm. And so we can't just trust it. And I remember there was a gentleman who recently got a promotion. So he's a VP at a major company. So I'm so excited about that. He put a thought in my brain. He was like, trust, but verify. And I think that's where the root of it needs to go. If we're going to help make a better difference in the communities that are being affected by this, you got to, yes, trust the data, but you need to verify that that's really the right thing. And then the rest starts to fall in line. And we're not even talking about data cleanliness. I'm talking about the columns and all that. We're not doing that. Not the data engineering, but really just the root of that data.
Well, can I ask Korri a question? Because that is so important, everything that you just said. And I love that. And one of the things that I often wonder about, and I'm not a ones and zeros person, is where are the folks that are doing the data annotations and the data associations? Like, companies are buying their data from somewhere, some third party, to train their models. And so there are actually humans that are doing the data associations and the data annotations. And I'm wondering why we don't have much more of a focus on those companies, because again, the life of the algorithm, we've seen the life of the algorithm. We've seen where it starts and we've seen where it ends up, and we see what happens with society. And we also see what happens when governments get involved, all because of what you said. There was some missed opportunity with this data at the very onset. So in your mind or opinion or expertise, how can we reach these companies that are actually doing the data associations and the data annotations? If that's
No, I think that's a wonderful question. My personal opinion, I think it's on us as practitioners and us that are using this data in different ways to push back and ask the questions, because sometimes it's trust but no verify. And so what's happening is it becomes like a staple. Oh, this organization that we get data from is the best of the best. And then guess what? It'll be an independent researcher that will go through and they'd be like, I was just curious. And so they'll look through and it'll be like, well, we were looking at this data and it looks like it's showing that, a particular area where, there was a tragedy for a certain group, men, women, whatever the case may be. It seems like it's telling the wrong story. Can you help me understand this? And then it'll go from those questions and then it just blows up into this whole thing. And then, all of the stuff that people have been working with for all these years, they're like, so I've been contributing to this. And I think we have to push back. We have to ask the question and we have to dive in. But unfortunately, not many organizations are in that position or even thinking about that as much as they really should. Because again, we put the overemphasis on the algorithm, and the algorithm, hey, that's a big part. Not going to downplay that. But if where the algorithm is being built from, if that's already messed up and you haven't taken the time to dive in, whose fault is it really? And I think that also gets into the other question from a liability standpoint.
That's an amazing point that you guys both brought up and expanded on. So it sounds like what I'm hearing is that there's a lack of accountability from the actual data sources, as opposed to the front-facing companies that we are sort of have been trying to hold accountable. But it seems like there's another side to this where they get their data from that we are not holding accountable. Is that right?
Yeah. And I think also even for some organizations, actual companies that don't produce external data, but produce their own data, especially if you're getting a survey design. Don't even get me started there. That's a whole nother bear. But they're actually generating their own data in-house. Sometimes they're not asking those questions because let's be 100% right now. Every aspect of human life has some degree of bias. It does, like if I'm walking down the street and I see a couple of guys playing basketball and I see a couple of ladies playing basketball, I'm going to go play basketball with the guys. I have already created bias right there in my brain. It's not something that I'm gonna get a lawsuit or anything about, but we as humans have a certain degree on that, even in companies. Like if I was the CEO of a company and my hometown was, let's say, Knoxville, Tennessee, if that was my hometown, my team may say, we're going to take better data in Knoxville, Tennessee, because I know the CEO is keeping his eyes on that, and we won't do as much elsewhere. It's weird. Not saying people are being malicious. I think just take down, it's there, and we have to be aware of it, accept it, and find ways to mitigate it.
Well, and our tech design is the sum of our lived experiences, right? So if a group of people have the same lived experiences and they're designing technology, it's gonna slant that way. And so we're the sum. We are the sum of our lives are the sum of the tech design you see out here. You can see it. And part of what's important to me in my research is now this focus that I'm also doing on the consumption of narratives. And I spoke about this earlier, like last year, Nielsen came out with a report that said for 12 hours out of the day, we were consuming various narratives via the web, a kiosk, your laptop, your phone, whatever it is. And I often think from a leadership perspective, and we get to choose some of those narratives by what interests we want. And I often think, how is that impacting the design or the decision to direct fair and equitable technology by the narratives that then create the biases, right? So it's very nuanced, it's very fascinating, but that's why I love to learn.
Yeah, it's amazing insight. So there's some comments in the chat. I think this topic is hitting home for me, so I want to spend some more time right here. So I'll just read out Erica's comment here. So Elizabeth, what you say about who does the data annotations associations is so relevant, and I don't hear enough about this. Partnership on AI did some work on responsible sourcing that tried to address this, as sometimes people doing this are quite removed from other levels. It gets outsourced sometimes to underpaid workers. Mm-hmm. And the question is, I'm curious, Elizabeth, whether you are familiar with this work about partnership on AI, and if so, what is your opinion of it?
I am familiar with partnership on AI. I'm not familiar with that particular work, but I think we've talked before about all hands need to be on deck. I think if they are actually doing that work of trying to figure out who is doing the data annotations and data associations, we need to amplify that, because that is actually brilliant and we're not talking about it enough. What we're talking about mostly are the impacts, all the way the second and third order impacts of what has happened, and not to what Korri highlighted initially about trust and verify. And there is a colleague of mine, his name is David Pogler. He has this saying that says, no application without representation. And so it would be someone saying, pushing back, someone who understands and has had a lived experience where they've been discriminated against, where they've experienced prejudice or racism. It's usually those people who have had certain experiences in life that then tend to be the ones to push back. But even further than that, we have to create environments where it's safe for them to raise their hand and raise their thoughts about what could happen.
Mm-hmm. And so the next question from Calvin is, what are your actionable insights to derail us from major biases? Would there be methodologies you can recommend? So what you just spoke about creating safe space for the people who do have that alternate perspective and do want to make those changes, would that be one of those actionable insights? And do you have any more?
I will let Korri speak to that, because that would be more of the at the data scientist, data engineer perspective. But from a leadership perspective, there's certainly a lot of guidance out there. UC Berkeley has something called the Equity Fluent Playbook. The World Economic Forum has guidance. The EU has guidance. United Nations has guidance. NIST has guidance. There's a lot of, and then Harvard has something, AI blind spots. There's a lot of tools that people can get started with. But, I'll just
Korri, we'd love to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah. So, this is such an important topic right here. Yeah. So when you get really, really tactical, I'm going to give you the MBA answer. It depends, because sometimes you can run statistics and you can kind of look at the distribution of the data. You can look at different things over time. You can identify some stuff. You start talking about all of the different techniques, but then there's also the people side of that. For instance, if I were to look at something, my lens is going to be, personally, I'm big on young professionals. I'm big on empowering young professionals. I start looking at the numbers, start looking at the age ranges of people. I start looking what data is in there, is even of anything protected in any type of way. And then sometimes there'll be protected data that in here, it's going to get weird, but there are certain cases where we'll bring data in and we're trying to avoid bias. And we'll say, I now have the race, the age, the gender in my data set. And now I'm going to take a look and I'm going to make sure it's not biased, right? Some people do that. That helps out to certain paradigms, but then there's stuff that's not in the data that you don't see. And that's where that business expertise, I know as Elizabeth's talking about, that leadership, you want to make sure you have an end-to-end pipeline. Don't keep it at the engineering level. There's a whole bunch that's there. Then there's the other side of this, where if I'm looking at those, and some people do this, and I think it's dangerous, but it depends. It really depends on what your work is. If you're doing something with HR, frankly, I avoid anything with modeling and HR with like the plague. I don't touch it, because you open yourself up with so many lawsuits and so many things that are there. There's so much research on that. I mean, from Amazon and Google and others, just do a search on that and you'll be really fascinated. But the other thing I think that is really going to be important here is that sometimes people will say, I'm going to remove anything that's going to identify, and I have no information about my customers. I just have the sales or blah, 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 blah. But you may be inherently still creating bias based off of how you're approaching it. And so it's one of those things to just be aware and have some way to kind of just double check, to go back. So if you're looking for we're going to use divergence, we're going to do this and blah, 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 not going to get into that. That's not the purpose of this talk. We can sit back and we can go through and maybe crunch some numbers, share a couple of algorithms or whatnot that may help you out. We can do that. But I think at the end of the day, it has to be a pairing. You first off, look at your data, get an idea about it. And again, not from just an engineering. I want somebody who's an SME or like an analyst who likes to analyze and dive into data. That's before a model goes out into production. So we should talking about AI before you click that button and say deliver. You want to kind of have that validation. It goes back to trust but verify. Yes, I know putting stuff in production takes some time, but that's like that stage when you want to do it. Take a look at the different factors, the possibilities. From a coding standpoint, we call it edge cases, right? That's what we call it. So think about the edge cases that, hey, you know what? We're trying to predict sales for a restaurant. Ask yourself the question. Here you go. When I predict these sales, am I lowering the sales in areas, not with lower socioeconomic, but with areas that have certain groups that live there? Hey, it's mostly African-American, but the socioeconomic status is higher than everything else. But because they're African-American and data I'm feeding into this, we're going to say the sales projection is lower. That's bias. So you got to ask those questions. Again, it's not just the technical. Get your SMEs, get the people who understand your business, your use case, asking the hard questions. Think about those edge cases together, and then you start to come up with something within your own organization. You'll have some type of plan or playbook that's going to work well for who you are, because we're all different. So I'll be quiet there, and if there's any other questions, I can dive in. But
yeah, I want to stay in this. There's a lot of engagement around this. There's a very tactical question here. I'm not going to read it out specifically, but basically the question is around how to navigate, the overtaxing of, Black employees or employees of color, when it comes to certain initiatives internal to companies that are additional to their actual work, so how does an organization navigate that?
Well, I'll add some of the ways that I've advised executives is to create like a social impact role where they're actually building relationships with members in the community and members in society to kind of help them because maybe they do have a pipeline issue. Maybe they don't have diverse folks, but they can certainly bring in folks to kind of help them work through the design and concept phases. I know I participated in employee resource groups and I was overtaxed as well. And I think that that's unfair. But what we can do is create these social impact roles where you're actually paying someone who is helping to advance your innovation and helping you catch some of these things. Pay them, in my mind, at the same rate as you would pay a data scientist or an engineer or even more. So I think that that's one way is to go outside of the organization. And that to me is where you're building relationships. I delivered to a client a couple months ago, 50 diverse tech organizations that they can partner with on things such as this, because there's no way they're going to be able to hire that fast. There's no way their organization can sustain, bringing on a bunch of technologists. But instead, what they can do is partner with these organizations and start building relationships, and they have done so. So that's just one example.
Amazing. Thanks for that. So we're going to move on from that just a bit and touch on something else that both of you mentioned is your approach to change internally into organizations. So Elizabeth, you mentioned more of a top-down approach where you engage with leadership. I'd like to know.
It's like right there, mid-sentence.
Right there. Bill, are you still with us?
I think we have the gist of the question, though, right?
What was it? He wanted to know what I do or what?
The top-down approach for like change in the organization, because I see a couple of things. Looks like Kelvin in here has been talking about change in the organization, making a difference. And so I think that's where Phil was getting to, like your approach where you're kind of working with leadership to help them understand.
Yeah, so everyone is different. I'm sure you know this, Korri. Every leader is different. Every organizational culture is different. And what we're talking about instituting is really a practice. There's never going to be a time where you deliver, a 10-point list and executives go off and do that and then everything's fine, right? And so for me, it's a longer term conversation. And I want to know, what is your business problem that you're trying to solve? What is it? And can AI help with that? And if that's the case, then let's talk about it. Are you doing something internally, customizing, whatever the thing is? It really is about what the business need is. Some folks or some clients that I have are AI companies, but they really wanted to create a culture of inclusion and more community so that the entire workforce felt it was safe if they wanted to raise issues, if they found that there was some sort of algorithmic bias happening in their organization. And then some are different, but I approach it based on the leader and the leadership style and the culture of the organization. I never try and force anything onto them. And it's important for me for many perspectives because I want impact. I want to make sure that something is done as a result of my conversations and interactions with these leaders. And so it's a very different role than being in society where you're pushing differently. You're pushing policymakers because there's a sense of urgency. And not that there isn't with leaders, but it's a different kind of temperament, Korri. And I'm sure that that you know that. So that's my approach. It's it's just based on my own personal leadership style as well.
Yeah, no, I love that. So you and I should partner in different organizations, just kind of rotate, because I kind of take actually a complementary approach to that when I talk about organizational change. I can give some pretty good examples from a few organizations I've been a part of, but ultimately I'm big on grassroots. I know with some folks, depending on the organizations, as we know, some leaders are inundated with all of these different things. And it's like, there's like this phrase where it says, if you tell somebody something once, they'll forget it. You got to tell it to them like 3, 4, 5 times. And then it's like, that's a great idea. We should do that. And so one of the things I try to do is I work a lot with like the boots on the ground practitioners, the young professionals, the folks that are SMEs in the space. And then we start to try to figure out what is it that we really want to achieve? Like, for instance, there was one case with one of the organizations I was with, and the conversation was, how do we change our data strategy? How do we centralize all of our data in one location? You got all these different business units and all the things that are there. And like, realistically, that would have been probably 2 years of leadership meetings of back and forth with multiple leaders across all levels. But what we decided to do, they messed up when they said, Korri, go forth and prosper, is that we started to sit down with the boots on the ground, because guess what? That was over 300 people that were boots on the ground. And so we started to educate and equip them with the tools necessary to begin to understand what we were doing and why. Small focus groups, small discussions. And then guess what? They then took it to their leaders. And so if their leaders at that next level up are now like, okay, I've heard this like 6 times and all of our our stand-ups, this must be important. Tell me more. And so then their leaders would go have their meeting with the other leaders, their leadership, and then it will pop up. And then their leadership would ask, so what you've done is you created, like, it's kind of like bowling, right?
Yes.
I hit that pin just right, and the rest of them start to fall. And so what that ultimately did was that changed how we were approaching certain bodies of work. And so I think at the end of the day, there's different approaches. Me personally, I'm really, really big on empowering the men and women that are boots on the ground, because guess what? If we can find that extra hour or two, and I see Kelvin talking about in the chat about mentoring and helping others, and how the impact of that extra time is like, if you can empower people to rock and roll, but then on the flip side of that, let's bring the business side. I got an MBA. Let me bring that in real quick. One of the things about it is you got to be able to quantify it. Quantify it as much as possible. So if, like, for instance, when we were doing those things, I would literally go and say, how long was our meeting? Great. And then I had documentation where I knew how many people were reading the documentation, how many meetings did not happen because we were doing what we were doing, the way we were doing it. And so we were like, we've saved thousands of hours of time by doing this approach. And this is the value to the organization. If we take this further, we'll save tens of thousands. And it was game, set, and match.
I love it. I love it. Phil, we only have 5 minutes left. I mean, Korri just preached the whole sermon here on how we can do this from in an organizational perspective, how we are approaching AI ethics, how we're approaching, doing the right things. And I love it.
Can you hear me?
Oh.
You are double timing it. There's two fields here. Is this field square? So good.
Yeah, we can see you and we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
I can't hear either of you. I'm sorry. I'm having some technical issues.
Welcome back, Phil. David said.
This is terrible. I will ask the questions. If you can you give me a thumbs up if you hear me? I can't hear you, but all right. So if everyone else hears me, that's fine. I won't hear what you have to say, but okay. So I want to close this up and really think about, from a Black sort of engineer, AI practitioner, tech talent perspective, someone who may be feeling overwhelmed or siloed because they're the only Black person in their organization or in their space. What can you share from having navigated those spaces yourselves?
Yeah. I will go, because I know what that feels like. I know specifically what that feels like to be the only one in many rooms, to be also the person that others in the organization see as some sort of a leader for them, to help get their initiatives across. What I learned, honestly, is I had to find what worked for me. I had to find my style. I had to find what my particular interests were, because for over 20 years, I have been carrying the burden of different people, because I've always been a pay equity champion, a diversity equity champion, a gender equity champion. But where I am now in my life is that I really have to center myself in what works for me. Where do I get the most joy? Where do I get the most peace? And that is what I advise anyone that I'm mentoring today, because there's a lot of concerns that people have about what's going to happen with their career. And if I had to tell my younger self something, it would be find your thing, find your place of peace, find out where you like to lead, find out how you like to lead, and do that. And it may not be that everyone has to take on this challenge just because you are Black or brown. You don't have to. There are some people who are really, really good at innovation. They love it, and that's where they play. And then there are others who want to make sure that, tech works for all. So for me, it's find your thing.
It looks like you came to an end. I can't hear anything you said. I'm sure it was wonderful. I'm going to have to watch the recording.
Go ahead, Korri.
But
Awesome.
Korri, I'd love to hear what you have to say on the topic as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. I resonate. So Elizabeth's just, I'm going to give you the snap. There we go. Just bring it. One of the things that when I walk into the room, it's me. It's like, hey, who is I'm a machine learning engineer. That's like a different tier in some cases. So it's just me. I remember when I was a pure mathematician going to a research institute, and it was just me. I remember working on my MBA, and there were 3 of us out of like a class of over 70 people. And for a while it weighed on me. And then I sat down with a mentor, because one of the things I try to do is, like, if you find yourself in that situation, find people with a little gray hair on their head, or folks that have been doing something. They could be big names or not. Trust and believe everybody has something to teach you. And this gentleman, he said, Korri, I told him, I was like, I'm just tired of being the only one in the room. I'm sitting there when I speak, I command the room. I know what I'm doing, all this other stuff, but it's just, I just feel heavy. And so he looked me in the eye and he said, take advantage of being the only one in the room today. And I was like, what do you mean? And so the mentality switch where it becomes draining, use it as empowering. Because when I walk into the room and it's just me, everybody's looking to say, who is this black guy that just walked in the room? Who is this guy? And so the limelight is on me. And so I can build the connections in that room to then help bring others into the room outside of coming in with the weight on my shoulders to say that this is so much. I can now say the weight is on my shoulders, but this is an opportunity for me to spread it out by building the relationships, learning what I need to learn, solidifying my own stance on a lot of things, and just blow open doors. Because I remember seeing some folks over the years where I can't say it was all me, but they had all the tools, but they didn't have the door that was cracked open enough for them to get into the door. And so I was able to crack the door open because I took advantage of being the only one in the room, because everybody wants to know, who are you? How did you get here? And so if you can tell your story and help that out, that blows things open. I know we're right around time, but the other thing I think about is being able to maximize on the experience and being able to share. We have to really come together and share with each other, engage people. Hey, I may be on the African-American side, but you best believe I can probably help some women who are like, hey, I'm the only woman in the room. I can sympathize with being the only one in the room. I can't empathize with being the woman, but I can give you some tools that have worked for me. I can we start talking about that. It's the human element. And if there's anything that I would encourage folks to think about in this entire space is, yes, there's technical, yes, there's leadership, yes, there's all of these different things, but sometimes it goes down to just the pure psychology of a human being, pure psychology of who we are, what makes us tick, and just taking some time to start to learn about those things, cognitive biases, dissonance, all of the stuff, and just take a day or two or a weekend and just read about it and expand your own thinking. And it will help you step in a different mind frame as you're navigating this and other things, as you're trying to fight the good fight for ethics and inclusive technical design. It is awesome. And so when you get those tools, you'll be like, I feel like Batman now. Just be like, today I'm going to use this tool built item, and I'm going to help somebody out. So that's kind of a long answer, but that's where my heart and passion is with being in that seat.
All right. Well, I think that draws it to a close. Thank you very much for your insight. Thank you to everyone who came and watched this event. This was really great. Again, I'm going to have to go back and listen to the end because I feel like the biggest nuggets were there. I was trying to read your lips, but it wasn't working. But thank you both for bringing your perspective and your expertise. It was great getting to know you both. Talk again soon.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Take care.